In the spring of 2020, I needed a video topic, and for my sins, Amazon's recommendation algorithm gave me one. The cover was enough to make me click, and the murderer's row of shitheads on the back cover blurbs was enough to make me click buy. I realized quickly I wasn't really qualified. I don't do culture stuff, and I don't do sex stuff, and I'm sure as hell not up to date on trans issues or science. So much of the book is based on anecdotal evidence and bare, unsighted assertion. There wasn't really much to debunk, and so I gave up on the idea of doing a video about it. And yet, for months afterward, the book kept haunting me. I've read lots of conservative literature, and it's all cruel. Cruelty's the raison d'etre, but I've never read something so sadistic. There was something off about this story that had nothing to do with the science. So I read it again, and I did some more research. And finally, I managed to find the dark underbelly of this story. This video is not about debunking the quote-unquote science underlying irreversible damage. Better, more qualified YouTubers have undertaken that task, and links to their video are in the description. Rather, this is a story about morality, and how it can be warped by conspiracy theories. How conspiracies act as a permission structure to be our most depraved selves. And how one cynical opportunist can use that depravity as a weapon to wield against her preferred targets. This is Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters.
The transgender craze seducing our daughters. Boy, that's a hot button subject, right? This is a minefield.
It shouldn't be, though.
No?
It really shouldn't be.
Some people, surely, as adults, are transgender.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course. I interviewed a lot of them.
And
The book's premise is fairly simple. There is an epidemic of cis girls being converted by transgender ideology, and then coming to regret it a few years later. And everyone is in on it. The activists, the teachers, colleges, the American Psychiatric Association, the media, the reverse vampires, This theory has a name. Rapid onset gender dysphoria. I knew about this conspiracy before reading the book. It has covalence across a diverse spectrum of political opinions. Rod Dreher, the thinking man's Count Frollo, is a true believer, as is The Federalist, the far-right news magazine that Abigail Shrier sometimes works for. But also a branch of radical feminism has emerged in the UK based around this conspiracy theory, at least in part. And lots of the concerned trolls in the intellectual dark web have given it space. But of course, all of you know at least one person who's fallen for this conspiracy theory. She is, after all, the world's most famous living author.
A hashtag reading RIP J.K. Rowling, as we said earlier, has been trending on Twitter. Harry Potter author has not died, but is the latest victim of cancel culture.
It was only a matter of time before someone tried to take it mainstream in the United States. Cue Abigail Shrier and her book.
Increasingly, Americans are forced to use language against their will or even their conscience, or be prepared to suffer the consequences. You don't have to be religious to believe that one person can never be a they. If gender activists prevail, we may be left with a world we neither recognize nor like very much. We won't be able to communicate our displeasure. We will have lost the words. I'm Abigail Shrier for Prager University.
Shrier paints a demented and fanciful picture of the social world teens live in, where being cis is so terrible and being trans is so glorified that girls feel they have no choice but to say they are trans, and are immediately and irrevocably put on a path towards getting their boobs hacked off and their uteri torn out. Does that sound extreme?
If you are a college freshman looking for friendship, hoping to be included, there's perhaps no more expedient means of obtaining a social life than signing up as LGBTQ. While the broader American culture endures constant flogging, LGBTQ identities enjoy a nonstop parade. The universities revile privilege and facilitate emancipation from it too. All they ask is a de minimis sacrifice to the intersectional gods. Your birth name is a good start.
If anything, I'm making the argument more subtle. So, we should be crystal clear here about what's being argued, and try to break it down into a series of questions that can be answered, instead of the way it's presented in the book as a sort of jumbled, disorganized set of dark insinuations, anecdotes, and scare tactics. The thesis statement here is, we need to ban kids from getting trans healthcare because too many cis kids are getting false positive diagnoses and doing irreversible damage.
He said it! He said it!
to their bodies. Let's break this down into a few statements that we can prove or disprove. Society is not transphobic. Rather, it is so adoringly and uncritically pro-trans that cisgender girls are deciding to pretend to be trans as a way of becoming popular. 2. Psychiatrists aren't doing their job of examining for differential diagnosis because they've been cowed by the PC mob, and so these girls are being fast-forwarded through their transitions. 3. Transitioning involves doing so much damage to the human body that it really shouldn't be allowed on children at all. 4. There are so many damaged girls and so few genuine trans men that the utilitarian thing to do would be to start denying care to people with gender dysphoria until we can figure out what's going on. So let's start at the beginning. Have we gone from being too transphobic to too not transphobic? What evidence does Shrier provide? Well, Caitlyn Jenner was on a magazine cover for one. For 2, sex education classes in schools say it's okay to be trans, which Abby refers to as gender ideology to make it sound scarier.
Schools that administer this instruction never acknowledge that, as a scientific matter, it's gibberish. It is biologically nonsensical to suggest that a girl's brain, every cell of it stamped with XX chromosomes, might inhabit a boy's body. Nonetheless, this drivel is taught with the same sobriety and apparent thoroughness as facts about human reproduction and sexually transmitted diseases. Imagine if anti-vaxxer groups, also representing a position miles outside the scientific mainstream, were brought in to speak to students.
Abby is going to do a lot of back and forth in this book about whether or not she thinks transgender people are real or not. Just bear with me. But the main target of her vitriol are YouTubers. It's transgender vloggers for whom Abby blames this on the most. The first time I read the book and then watched the YouTubers she talked about, I was genuinely shocked she was able to get this published. She's accusing specific non-public figures of doing horrible things without evidence. Like, there's real libel and defamation liability here. Like, some claims could be the result of sloppiness.
Many influencers will tell you, as queer influencer Ashley Wilde puts it, having doubts while you question your gender is 100% normal. One might think that they'd advise exercising caution about transitioning, given the capriciousness of one's gender feelings. But the reverse is true. Doubts should never stop your transition. As far as I can tell, nothing should.
So, I managed to track down this video.
Having doubts while you question your gender is 100% normal.
One might think that they'd advise exercising caution about transitioning.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
My last piece of advice, wait it out. You can't know how you will behave in a situation that you've never been in. You can't know what will be comfortable for you if you've never tried it. So just wait it out. Give it time. Don't be in any rush.
One might think that they'd advise exercising caution about transitioning.
Some lines could technically, possibly be an honest mistake, but it would really strain credulity.
As Chase Ross puts it in his Trans 101 video series, testosterone brings more legitimacy to your transition. But then Chase rushes to reassure, the legitimacy of your transition is how you define your transition. You might have heard that testosterone comes with bad side effects, but you'll rarely hear them mentioned here.
If you go to that video, the next video in the playlist is The Dangers of Hormone Replacement Therapy. It would be very hard to miss. Shrier also crosses the line into outright libel, cutting quotes up to make them say things they don't actually say.
Many influencers define dysphoria so broadly that nearly every teen would seem to have it. Chucking the DSM-5 aside, or perhaps blissfully unaware of it, trans YouTuber Jake Edwards advises that even if you don't have traditional gender dysphoria, you might still have one of the other types. For example, there's a social dysphoria, which includes anything in a social situation that makes you feel negative about yourself. Those of us plagued with social anxiety are officially on notice. We're probably trans.
I'm sorry, let's roll that again.
For example, there's a social dysphoria, which includes anything in a social situation that makes you feel negative about yourself. Those of us plagued with social anxiety are officially on notice. We're probably trans.
Now, let's go to the tape.
There are many other types of dysphoria. For example, there is social dysphoria. That is a feeling when people around you don't view you as the gender you are, or anything in a social situation that makes you feel negative about yourself or your gender.
Those of us plagued with social anxiety are officially on notice. We're probably trans.
So, I'm no legal eagle, but that's libel, right? Like, even if you assume a YouTuber getting 30,000 views makes them a public figure, which it doesn't, trust me, you can't not know what you're doing when you edit a quote that way. Like, that's actual malice. And to be clear, what Edwards is describing is in the DSM. But Abigail's main tactic is the pronoun game. When she can't find evidence of actual mainstream social media accounts saying you should lie to your therapist, she instead resorts to random anonymous Reddit comments. And then to tie them together, she just goes on for the rest of the chapter using the word they.
Many of them peddle misinformation, outright medical falsehoods, and just bad advice. They extol the glories of testosterone as if it were a protein shake, not a Schedule III controlled substance. They enthuse over double mastectomies as if they were of no more significance than a haircut.
Who's they? I don't know. All we know is she definitely means more than one person.
You don't have to be religious to believe that one person can never be a they.
On top of lying about what they say, she also feels the need to grade their looks.
Jet Taylor is, like his name, hot. Recalls that cute boy in your freshman dorm with the tousled auburn hair. His face bears a smattering of acne, another side effect of the testosterone. The trans equivalent of battle scars. A soft-faced, bare-cheeked, and mostly female-looking Chase, boyishly adorable, scruffy-jawed Alex. Her elfin adorableness makes her look all of 12. She's in her late 20s, is a natal female with a squeaky voice and a strong Midwestern accent. Cute as a Cupid doll. Looks something like the body of an 8-year-old boy.
This is by far one of the most exciting moments of my life.
Gushes a still obviously female but trans-identifying YouTuber Elliot James. Elliot tears apart the gray polyethylene envelope, pulls out the cellophane-wrapped binder, dances, tongue-wagging and lightly shrieking. Breasts may be painful reminders of one's birth sex, but apparently shrieking is not. And because the internet knows no shame, Elliot tries it on for our benefit, bearing rose-tattooed arms, struggling a little against the punishing elastic, emitting a string of expletives. Turning sideways, Elliot shows off her flattened physique, a bulldozed version of a woman's profile.
Needless to say, these people's real crime is being happy while trans, on camera, where innocent children can see it. That is supposedly the irresistible draw, tricking cis kids into doing testosterone. I'm not convinced. In all the cases described in the book, gender transition was being overseen by a trained professional. Doctors who were adhering to the guidelines set by their respective mainstream professional associations. So in order for this whole transphobe house of cards to stay up, the entirety of psychiatry has to be discredited.
Colleges have hired a battalion of mental health counselors. They specialize in things like eating disorders and trauma support, but also sexual and gender identity issues. In fact, it's possible to sign up with a college counselor wanting to talk about, say, depression, and discover that her other expertise is LGBTQ. So you're feeling sad. What could be the source? Spoiler alert, you're probably trans.
So instead of trying to provide direct evidence, she tries to insinuate to the reader that psychiatrists are operating under a sort of trans reign of terror. That if they turn down even one kid who wants hormones, they will be harassed out of their career. She retells the story of Ken Zucker. Zucker is a psychiatrist who's at the heart of a controversy over how to treat kids with gender dysphoria. And by kids, I mean little kids. That controversy over whether or not you should push kids toward gender confirmation before letting them transition is complicated and not within the scope of this video. What matters for us is that around the same time as this controversy was happening, Zucker got slapped with an accusation of sexual harassment, and that ended up forcing him to resign. Now, Shrier does not outright state that actually this accusation of harassment was entirely fabricated by the trans lobby to punish him for his dissident views. Because again, libel laws exist, but she tries very hard to imply it, and thus imply it could happen to any psychiatrist. And as a reward for trying to rehabilitate his career, Zucker lends his authority as a practicing doctor to boost Abigail's book. The W-Path Manual for Dealing with Gender Dysphoria, which is the main authority on how to do affirmative care, still recommends going slow and making sure to dot every I and cross every T before doing medical transition. So if transgender activists are asserting pressure on psychiatrists to rush kids through transition, they're apparently doing it below the radar. Claim 3. There are 5 parts of transitioning that Shrier goes over. Binders, blockers, hormones, top surgery, bottom surgery. The first 2 are easily reversible. The last 2 aren't allowed on minor-aged children. How does Abby try to make all of them sound scary?
Nearly every female-to-male guru started her transformation with a binder, a spandex and polyester compression garment that, worn under clothing, effectively flattens breasts. What trans videos like Elliot's rarely mention are the dangerous medical side effects. Fractured or bruised ribs, punctured or collapsed lungs, shortness of breath, back pain, and deformation of the breast tissue are side effects.
Broken, perforated lungs? Okay, yeah, fine, you got me there. Boys, if you're wearing your binders so tight, you break all your ribs and give yourself a pneumothorax. Maybe don't do that. A bunch of ink is spilled on the hypothetical side effects of Lupron, the hormone-blocking chemical used to keep kids from hitting puberty before they can make the decision about transitioning, but no actual evidence for those side effects. And the chapter on bottom surgery is just pages and pages of graphic descriptions of bot surgeries, a favorite topic of the ROGD conspiracy websites I would later discover. Hormones work gradually, so none of the changes that come from using them are irreversible unless you've been on them for a few months, which means plenty of time to reconsider once you've started. So Shrier has to come up with an excuse for why even trying hormones should be unacceptable. The theory she came up with is that testosterone is a wonder drug.
Testosterone suppresses anxiety and even lifts depression. It makes young women bold and unafraid. For the socially inhibited, the freedom it offers can feel like nothing short of a miracle. Of course, it can also lessen short-term memory and increase moodiness and irritability, but that's someone else's problem. Was I rude or pugnacious? Sorry, it's just that I feel so good.
It gets you high on manliness. Trying testosterone will get you addicted to how good it makes you feel. And just coincidentally, that feeling of euphoria goes away at the exact same moment that the physical changes become permanent. So, what are those disfiguring permanent changes? Well, your voice gets deeper. That's it. I mean, there are other changes, but those are either reversible or they don't hit for years. The intersection of permanent changes and changes that occur after a short while are your voice gets deeper. That's the irreversible damage of irreversible damage. Claim 4. Abigail Shrier never comes out and says she thinks trans people aren't real. She puts a lot of effort into implying that she believes the opposite, in order to boost her credentials as a tolerant, compassionate person. But she insists on misgendering people who she has no reason to think fit into the profile of false positives she's writing about.
Tina Brandon renames herself Brandon Tina, chases girls, swigs beer, and joyrides through rural Nebraska dressed as a boy, and mostly passing as one.
In fact, the reason she wrote this book is because she was contacted by parents.
This wasn't a personal issue for me. In fact, it was an issue originally I thought I was going to avoid. A reader wrote to me. I write most often for the Wall Street Journal, and a reader wrote to me and she said, listen, I've tried to get every mainstream journalist to pick this up. No one will touch it, but my daughter got caught up in this.
What she leaves out is the reason parents contacted her is because she was already known as an anti-trans writer.
Totalitarian thinking. It was once completely foreign to America. Not anymore. A decade ago, few people could even tell you what the word transgender meant. Today, expressing the wrong opinion on the issue can cost you your business, or job, or both. Consider recent state and local actions punishing those who decline to use an individual's pronouns of choice. In 2017, California Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation threatening jail time for healthcare professionals who willfully and repeatedly refused to use a patient's preferred pronouns.
This wasn't a personal issue for me. In fact, it was an issue originally I thought I was going to avoid.
What about the vast majority of citizens who hold the biology-based view that chromosomes determine your sex, male or female?
This wasn't a personal issue for me. In fact, it was an issue originally I thought I was going to avoid.
You don't have to be religious to believe that one person can never be a they.
In fact, it was an issue originally I thought I was going to avoid.
Sure, Jan. So for Abby, the utilitarian calculus is easy. If even one cis kid is being hurt, it's worth screwing over 1,000 trans kids. But what if we, like the overwhelming scientific consensus, do deign to believe that transgender people exist? How many cis kids would need to be getting hurt in order for the numbers to add up? Abigail never makes a claim about how many kids she thinks are getting sucked into this craze. She does, however, quote statistics showing a big increase in the number of teens seeking trans medical care.
In Britain, the increase is 4,000%, and 3/4 of those referred for gender treatment are girls.
A 4,400 increase. Ooh, sounds pretty sus. How many are there now, like 1 million? Oh. Hold on. Let me do a little back-of-the-envelope calculation here. There are about 7.5 million teenagers in the UK. Let's assume a 50-50 gender ratio. So that's 1,800 divided by 3.75 million to get 0.048%. Less than 0.5% of 1%. And that's not even a count of people who got hormones. That's just the percentage of people who got referred to be looked at. So how many trans men should there be?
The most recent Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, reports an expected incidence of gender dysphoria at 0.002 to 0.003% for natal females. This is an incidence of fewer than 1 in 10,000 people.
If you actually open up the DSM-5 to that page, the literal next sentence is, "This number is an underestimate." That statistic is based on how many people got referrals to hormone clinics in the 90s. So as far as figuring out whether the increase is because of a craze or because of less social stigma and more awareness, using the DSM numbers is basically begging the question. The lowest estimate of self-reporting from years before the alleged craze puts the prevalence at about 0.1%. So 0.20% would imply there are more than twice as many trans people not getting medical care than the maximum number of fake positives. Perhaps it's not surprising that despite this massive epidemic, Abigail could only find 5 credible reports. 5 with an asterisk. Also credible with an asterisk. The spine of irreversible damage is the profiles of 5 girls Abby thinks falls into this new category of fake transgender. We do not get to hear from these kids at all, only the parents. The girls come out as trans. The parents refuse to believe them. This disagreement destroys the relationship, and we are led to blame this on some sort of outside contaminant. A school friend, a counselor, YouTube, college professors, a school assembly, therapists, even DeviantArt.
Online, Julie began to visit DeviantArt, an art-sharing website with a large transgender following and a lot of gender ideology in its comments section.
You name it. So, what is the damage for these 5 girls? First, there's Lucy, who came out to her parents as a college freshman, took testosterone for only 3 months before quitting it, and it's not even clear if she actually stopped identifying as trans. There's Julie, who wasn't allowed hormones until she was an adult, and didn't get top surgery for a few years later, and she still hasn't desisted. Sally's story starts not with evidence that she's cis, but with special pleading about how the very clear evidence she was trans shouldn't count.
She went through a very short period when she was 4 or 5 of wanting to be a boy. And we thought that was very much of a piece with having these older brothers. And she cut her own hair with scissors.
Sally didn't come out until she was a junior in college, and her desistance is questionable. Joanna came out to her parents at 17, but again, she didn't start transitioning until she was an adult, and she still hasn't desisted. Gayatri desisted before starting hormones. That's the end of the story. Why is this story even here? Maddie's the only kid in the book who actually transitioned at a young age. He transitioned before trans identity allegedly became trendy. As far as I can tell from the book, he's still happily living as a man. His mom, Catherine, on the other hand, is a harrowing story of internet radicalization and how it destroys families.
Catherine Cave is often accused of being a transphobe. In truth, had she been less indulgent of her daughter's gender exploration, the last 7 years of her life might have been easier, and she approached her daughter's announcement with a strikingly open mind.
Spoiler alert, she wasn't actually that open-minded.
Catherine didn't quite know what to make of her daughter's self-assessment. The description of gender dysphoria didn't seem to fit her daughter, who had never been anything like a tomboy. She called 10 different therapists and explained the situation to each one.
I'm sorry, 10? 10 therapists? 10? After you got the 8th second opinion, you were like, 9th time's the charm.
All of the therapists said the same thing to me. They said, at this age, kids know who they are. If Maddie thought she might be transgender, then by definition, she was. That explanation didn't feel right to Catherine. Her daughter just didn't seem like a boy trapped in a girl's body.
She then admits to eavesdropping on her son's therapy sessions and deciding that because the therapist wasn't actively trying to dissuade her son from becoming a man, he wasn't doing his job.
Catherine searched the internet for an explanation for her daughter's sudden trans identification. Anything that might offer an alternative to the chorus of therapists encouraging her to treat Maddie as a boy. I couldn't find anything that would support my thoughts. The only thing I could find online was anti-gay sort of hateful criticism.
Maybe that was the sign, Catherine?
She began posting what she had learned on discussion forums about transgender-identified adolescents, Maddie's psychological entrenchment in her boy identity after having been affirmed. Her posts, she says, were deleted, and she was banned from discussion boards.
But then, she met like-minded individuals.
Catherine's research eventually took her to Transgender Trend, a UK-based website, and Fourth Wave Now, its American counterpart, gender-critical forums for parents who were skeptical of their adolescents' sudden identification as transgender. With the help of sites like Fourth Wave Now, Catherine Cave began to realize that her daughter had become caught in a cultural current, and she wasn't alone.
Catherine has apparently devoted herself to this new cause, at the cost of seemingly everything.
She continues to work under a pseudonym, and her sense of isolation is keen. She has everybody on her side. I mean, I don't have a leg to stand on.
It's taken her home. She moved into the rural South in the hope that that would cure Maddie's dysphoria.
Catherine Cave finally agreed to meet me in August 2019 in a rural southern town to which she and her husband had relocated the family in a desperate attempt to outrun the forces that had ensnared their daughter.
Her friendships, her relationship with her daughter, even her identity.
Many of the mothers of suddenly trans-identifying teenage girls have grown disillusioned with progressivism and disaffected from the Democratic Party. Several have been betrayed by progressive friends who went behind their backs to buy their daughters a binder or to give girls encouragement in what their mothers viewed as a regimen of self-harm. I just don't believe anything anymore. I can't tell you what my politics are anymore.
She's become a paranoid wreck.
Her need to maintain anonymity is ferocious. I was there to interview her about the subject most urgent and painful to her in the world. But as she strode in, trim and serious, her hair pulled back tight as her nerves, I had the keen sense that I was the one being interviewed.
She gave up a job as a corporate lawyer in order to pursue anti-trans activism full-time.
Catherine eventually founded the Kelsey Coalition, an organization devoted to opposing transgender ideology.
I looked up Catherine's Heritage Foundation-backed think tank. I don't recommend it. The spiritual effect of reading these websites can only be described as soul-crushing. The bad science is the least of it. It's the parent testimonies. A kid comes out to their parents. The parents refuse to accept it. They rage at therapists for not offering a cure. They act out passive-aggressively against their kids. They rage at schools and school friends for respecting the kids' wishes over their own. They end up blaming the schools and the friends and the psychiatrists for not going along with their plan to cure the kid through passive-aggressive negging. Sometimes they physically isolate the kid to get the desired result. A common tactic is to diagnose or get the kid diagnosed with high-functioning autism as a means of discrediting their identity. They don't bother explaining the relevance. The dysphoria persists. Because any medical intervention requires parental consent before at least the age of 16, these kids aren't actually in any danger of harm. But because it's not a phase, they simply wait until they're old enough. This persistence does not change the parent's mind. The relationship falls apart. On an intellectual level, they believe transsexuality is a real phenomena, but they are certain their kid does not count. They find a community on the internet that tells them it's some shadowy cabal's fault. Because if society were simply forced to comply with their wishes, if there was no place for the kid to escape, everything would have turned out great. So they attack other transgender kids, those whose parents had the temerity to accept their child's diagnosis early on and seem happy, perhaps out of an unspoken sense of jealousy. They get hooked on the self-righteous rage. They encourage each other to be crueler and meaner. Abigail encourages parents to be crueler and meaner. She goes out of her way to make sure you know all of these kids' parents are nominally liberal.
Mary had always been a political liberal, a P-flag leader, and a supporter of gay marriage long before it was legal. But Catherine was on the political left. Her mothers are gay Midwesterners. She enthusiastically supported gay marriage long before it was legal anywhere in America.
At first, I thought this was to implicitly argue that the problem couldn't possibly be the parents are bigoted, perish the thought. But now, I realize for Abigail, this is a comeuppance. She blames them.
Sometimes I wondered whether all this open-mindedness hadn't robbed their daughters of the rebellion they so badly seemed to want. Maybe if they had put up monstrous opposition to, say, their daughters joining the gay-straight alliance in middle school. Maybe if they hadn't been there with a camera and hugs when their daughters wore tux to prom. Maybe if they'd faked horror or moral opprobrium they didn't feel and unleashed a tirade or lecture or fit of exasperation worthy of a John Hughes movie. Maybe their daughters would have declared victory and deemed their war of independence a success.
If your kid's dysphoria doesn't go away, it's not because it's real. It's because you weren't hard enough. You might recall that a similar affliction sometimes affects the parents of children with autism.
If you believe the MMR vaccine contributed to or caused your child's autism, please stand up and raise your hand.
Well, now there's a new madness spreading across the planet to parents of trans kids. And here swoops in Abigail Shrier to spread it as far and wide as possible, like a mosquito. There's an epidemic, all right, and it is being spread on the internet. But it's not trans ideology. Now, it's worth pointing out that desistance in these stories might just mean went back in the closet. After all, our only source is the transphobe parent. But even granting that, the overlap in these stories between kids who did anything irreversible and the kids who definitely desisted is zero. Zilch. Nada. So where's the fucking damage? This book is selling a bill of goods.
This book is not about transgender adults.
That's the first sentence of the book, after the intro story about Lucy. And it's literally a lie. Even if we accept every evidence-free assumption in this book, and we accept the premise that all these girls really are just crazy members of some deviant art-based gender cult. The premise of the book is still based on conflating two different phenomena. ROGD, or rapid onset gender dysphoria, is a theory that teenage girls can become convinced they're trans through peer pressure. By definition, it has nothing to do with the little kids whose parents have to make the actually fraught and difficult decision of whether or not to go through a transition before puberty. And the book is decidedly about the former. And for all the bluster, it never claims that there's been an explosion in little kids identifying as trans. So why is so much of the book devoted to the side effects of Lupron, which none of these daughters used? Why is the section about Ken Zucker and his controversy there? Why is the accusation that transgenders are seducing our girls? And why the hell is it right next to a picture of a fucking mutilated 8-year-old? It's because whether or not this craze is real or not, girl makes bad decision after going to college is not a crisis, let alone something worth legislating about. It is decidedly a dog bites man story. But it lends itself to the illusion that transgender adults are sexually abusing minors because they're seducing them into abusing themselves in a manner that could be described as sexual. Because the right has an axe to grind against trans people, and it knows, won't somebody think of the children is their best bet to enlist the general public in their crusade against them. And because Abigail Shrier is not a journalist trying to cover a new trend. She's a right-wing hack trying to stir up a panic which, if successful, will get people killed. Please don't turn her into a free speech martyr. But if you must insist, and clearly some people must insist, I have a piece of advice. Don't say anything about Abigail Shrier or Lisa Littman you would not want to be quoted as saying about Andrew Wakefield or Jenny McCarthy. Because I assure you, they will go down in history as one and the same. I just want to thank my patrons, Ryan Refner, Knowing Better, Jason Yance, Tedsville, Kimma Berry, Farty Barf Slab, Deanna Banana, Big Nove, and Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion. And I also want to thank Pamela Almond, the lady who read the book on Audible, for just perfectly capturing the bitchiness of the original text. Follow me on Twitter, or follow me on Patreon. If you like this video, you might like other videos. I have one about Dinesh D'Souza and how the party switched on race issues. I have one on Venezuela. I'm not really sure what the overlap is between trans issues and 30-minute documentaries on the economy of Venezuela, but who knows?